everybody. Welcome to InPsightRadio. I am your host, Danielle Egnew, and you are a fly on the wall to everywhere. Oh man, I'm excited about this podcast today. Okay, because why? Because we get to talk about one of my very favorite subjects. I mean, seriously, I am so happy to be with you this week. I'm happy to be with you every week. Yet this week, I get to talk about something fabulous. I get to talk about Sasquatch. Oh, I love it. Listen, gang, there are a few things in this world that still really get me excited. And we don't talk ghosts that much on the podcast. I mean, we do sometimes, just kind of depending on the week. Yet I love cryptozoological phenomenon. I love sea monsters. I love Bigfoot. I love looking for these phenomenon that people think just flat out don't exist. And the reason I love it is because it does exist, and I love to educate people on what the heck is Bigfoot. What is a Sasquatch? What is it? What is it? I mean, literally, gang, Sasquatch, this creature, this being has been documented, especially just here in the Americas, for the last 400 years, not only from settlers, not only from people who have been going out into the middle of deep wooded areas, yet the Native American nations. This has been huge, huge. And, we don't even think about that because we think of Bigfoot and we think of somebody drinking too much Jack Daniels, seeing things in the mountains of, Montana, Kentucky, the outback of Washington State. We think of people making stuff up, or they missaw this creature in the woods. It could be a bear. Can I just tell you something? I don't live in the woods. I live in Billings, Montana. It is the largest city in the state. And we were up in Bozeman for a year. We did a bunch of work up there, and we've moved back to my hometown in Billings. So, when we look at this, I mean, this whole thing, you look at Bigfoot, what the heck is it? Bigfoot is not something you would mistake for a bear. And if you live in a place like Montana, where you see a whole bunch of animals all the time out in the woods in the wilderness, and I may not live in the wilderness, but I used to live in there right on the edge of the Gallatin Mountain Range up in Bozeman and Gallatin Gateway. And believe me, you can tell the difference between a bear and even a grizzly bear, which may be, a really, really big grizzly bear might be 5.5, 6 feet from its shoulders to the floor. You're not going to find a bear that's walking bipedally that's 12 feet tall. I mean, bears will stand up on their back legs, but they just kind of stand up. They don't go like trucking through the forest like a Disney cartoon, okay? So here is Sasquatch, here is Bigfoot, and we have had sightings of this creature in the Americas for such a long time. And, we talk about Bigfoot a lot when we think of the Pacific Northwest, or really the Rockies, because we have a ton of Bigfoot sightings in Montana. And there is a bandwidth, and we'll get into what Bigfoot is in just a little bit. However, we see a lot of Bigfoot sightings up around the Missoula area in Montana, and that's because Missoula is in a very specific ley line area that also has, it's akin to a lot of vortex points up there. And it's weird. If you go up to the Missoula area in Montana, Flathead Lake, that whole area, it gets weird because the forest looks like something that you would see in the Pacific Northwest. You've got really different type of redwood trees. And I actually don't know if they are actual. I believe somebody told me they're a type of redwood and they're not the redwoods. But then I was told that there actually is a giant plot of the redwoods up in this little microclimate up there. So if you can think of Washington State, you don't think of Montana as having this ferny microclimate, yet in that corner of the state we do, and that's actually where a ton of the Bigfoot sightings happen in Montana. A lot more up there than in eastern Montana, which is a lot of rolling plains and badlands. So when we're thinking about the Pacific Northwest, it's really the West, it's the Rockies in general. And the Native American populations out here and on the coast and on the East Coast and in the Midwest and in the Southwest, they all regard Bigfoot with a ton of spiritual respect. Because for them, it's not just somebody hoaxing somebody in an ape suit that they rented at a 24-hour costume shop, okay? Bigfoot in these cultures is often called the big man or the big hairy man, and he is seen as an emissary, a spiritual emissary. And he only appears, according to a lot of Native American legend, to people who have special gifts and abilities or people who are going to do something special. So when you see Bigfoot, it's because typically, if you are to go with the Native American belief, it's because this is a spirit emissary that is coming over here to actually make itself known and touch base with humankind. It's a very special being. Okay. And Bigfoot is actually, Sasquatch is in the elemental category. And we've heard the podcast on the little people of the prior mountains. I'm on an elemental kick right now. And so when we look at the way that all of this is wrapped around, and we look at the elemental genres that we have, there's fae, the fairies, the little people, the gnomes, the trolls, the elfin folk, and Sasquatch. So Sasquatch is actually part of the elemental kingdom. And it's been my experience when I've been hunting Sasquatch. I don't even like that word, hunting, really. When I've been out wandering around, hoping I see a Sasquatch. How about that? I've noticed that these beings follow ley lines. They follow electromagnetic lines. Sasquatch will walk for miles and miles underneath of electrical power lines, because where you find those areas in very wooded mountains, those areas where they cut down a whole bunch of trees and then they put up those massive electrical line relays. And generally those are coming off of a dam like Hoover Dam, or it could be one of many. And Sasquatch will actually walk along those pathways. And part of it is because there is an extreme amount of electromagnetic leakage off of those wires that will, for all intents and purposes, imitate a naturally occurring ley line or a naturally occurring fold or fold in space. It's a naturally occurring thing. So when you look at this being that is able to go through space-time, the Celtic regions call this space-time fairy rings. You're looking at a being, Bigfoot, Sasquatch, that can go through vortex portals that are naturally occurring on the earth. And this is why we see their hair or we see their footprints, but we don't find a Bigfoot carcass because they don't spend all of their time over here. They come in, they were literally stewards of the forest. They are stewards of nature. And like I was saying earlier, the Native American cultures believe that Bigfoot is an intercessor between humankind and nature. So if you see a Sasquatch, it's because it's actually doing a job. It's there to bring you a message, perhaps of conservation, perhaps of just the fact that you are a holy person and they want to interface with you and tell you that there's something greater than yourself out there. So it's really interesting because when you're talking about the Native American cultures, the elders in those cultures really do see Sasquatch as straddling the bridge between natural mammal consciousness, animal consciousness, and what's happened with the hominins or the humans or the Cro-Magnon man or the human consciousness. So it's an emissary that is an elemental that's built to be a little more hospitable towards human beings, believe it or not, than say the little people of the prior mountains, or the fae or the fairy folk in the Celtic regions. So those beings can't stand people. They put up with us, but you really have to work to get them to not think that you're just awful, because their job is not to necessarily interface with us. But then you've got Sasquatch, which is this bridge elemental that comes out, shows itself to people, and generally shows up when there are conservation issues, which I think is really interesting, and we'll get to why in just a bit. And it's not like Sasquatch is superior to human beings or superior to any other elemental. It's not like Sasquatch is superior to other animals. It's just that this elemental being can phase shift, and its job is not only nature, but to bring messages to humankind. So I think this is all so fascinating, because here we in white Western culture, in Western European migrated to America culture, we want to kill this thing. We want to find it and shoot it and make it a trophy. Whereas our native brothers and sisters, they look at this being completely differently. They think that it is a holy relationship with this being. They believe that they are in kinship with this being if this being comes to them and shows them who it is. And, honestly, it makes me sad, because when we think about how disconnected we've gotten as a European white Western expansion culture with nature, there's a reason that we don't see Bigfoot. And according to the native legends and the native accounts, Sasquatch only really comes out when they want to be seen, and they want someone to specifically see them. And, it is a physical being. It does. We found Bigfoot droppings. There was a case in Alaska where the Sasquatch was coming out of the forest, and this man had built a very rustic cabin way out in the outback of Alaska. So it's not like he was in a neighborhood. Okay, he was way in the forest. And this being would come out and just start beating on the cabin and beating on the roof of the cabin and beating on the sides of the cabin. And it scared the guy to death. And it would come around to the front door and just beat the dickens out of the door. Well, this guy got sick and tired of this creature coming out of the woods. He was ruining the cabin. It scared him because this thing is huge. It's 12 feet tall, just pounding on your cabin. So he took a board, just a regular old piece of plywood, and the guy zipped screws up through the plywood, okay? So the pointy, ridged part of the screws are all sticking up through the wood. And then he placed the piece of plywood in his front door area. Like where a welcome mat would be, but it was huge. Well, of course, this Sasquatch came out, and as an elemental, this man didn't realize, I'm sure, that where he put his cabin could have been on an intersecting vortex point. It could have been on some crossing ley lines. There could have been energy needing to be managed at that spot that this guy he just knew nothing about, and as we do as people, build this cabin. So here comes this Sasquatch, which is trying to beat this thing down into the ground and knock it over. Every night, this thing would come out. So the night that he put the board out, the Sasquatch came around to the front door and went to come up to the door and bang on the door and just shrieks because its bare feet are impaling itself on the screws. Okay? So then you hear this big commotion. This thing is screaming and crying, trying to pull its feet off of the screws, and it goes into the woods. Well, the guy doesn't go out that night. He waits till the morning. And he goes out in the morning, and there is flesh and hair stuck in the screw, literally in the screw. It just makes me, it gives me the creeps. The screw threads had flesh and hair clinging to them. So the fella takes the flesh and the hair, and he sends it in for genetic testing. And part of the genetic testing matches up with some of it is semi-human, and the other part of it is some animal that they have absolutely no genetic reference for. So they really couldn't, say what it was. And, I'm sure that poor Bigfoot, I don't think it came back, but God, to get your feet ripped up like that. Yet what we don't understand as human beings is these creatures are exceptionally docile. They are very gentle generally. The only time you hear about Sasquatch attacking something is if it's way in the deep woods. And again, if we look at the role that elementals play in nature, they keep ley lines clear and they keep certain vortex doorways clear, because there are just some places that human beings shouldn't live, gang. I mean, the human brain cannot handle a large yield of EMF. It just can't handle it. If we have too much EMF in our brain, we experience we hallucinate, okay? I can't even say the word. We hallucinate, our skin itches, we begin to feel watched. We can get severe and extreme headaches. This is how the human body reacts to too much EMF. And a lot of these vortex points that these elementals guard are naturally occurring points where a ton of electromagnetic energy and magnetic energy are coming out of the ground. And it's really weird because we as human beings have this bizarre, messed up ability to completely put ourselves exactly where we shouldn't be. I mean, we will build houses. We will dig pools. We naturally feel these hot spots in the earth, and we want to dig them up and build something on them. Well, just because we are electromagnetically aligning with an area does not mean that we should live there. So the only accounts I've ever heard of Sasquatch attacking something were really in the deep woods, and my money is on the fact that human beings were disturbing a ley line, were interrupting a vortex flow. It would be like standing on somebody's arm until the blood in their hand just drains and their fingers go to sleep. I mean, that's a really goofy example, but that's literally what happens when we disturb ley lines, okay? So when we're looking at our Native American cultures, they understand this sacred big man that is a spirit bridge or a spirit intercessor that is also flesh, just like the little people up in the prairies and in the Bighorn Mountains and all over the world. They're also flesh. They just have the ability to go from one place to another place through those electromagnetic folds or vortexes. And there have been all kinds of fascinating Bigfoot videos where somebody's got this thing and they're zooming in and it's pixely and weird, but they can see something moving through the trees and then it literally just disappears into thin air. And those videos have been debunked and they've been this and they've been that. And the best skeptical response to those videos is that there was some sort of glitch. And this was back in the days of like mini DV. So we're not talking digital, we're talking tape, some of these, or VHS tape, roughly 10,000 years ago, VHS. So you get this phenomenal and fascinating being disappearing in thin air. And the skeptical response was that there was a tape glitch and the tape just kind of stuttered and the thing walked out of the frame, but the tape didn't catch it. And then all of a sudden started recording where there was nothing. That's an awful lot of specific technical problems. I think it's probably more probable that you had an elemental being that just crossed through a vortex in nature. And if you haven't been in a lot of nature, as somebody who lives right by a ton of nature, I will tell you there are areas you can be wandering around in the forest, and all of a sudden you just get this creepy feeling. Have you ever had that? It just gets creepy, and you feel the creeps come up over the back of your neck. And I have been out hoping to encounter a Sasquatch. That's why I don't want to call it Bigfoot hunting, because they know if you're hunting them and they just hide. I've been out attempting to encounter one, and I can feel the ether change when they come around. And I have yet to have one show itself to me. but I can feel them coming forward and I get really nervous because, when you can feel something, and sometimes you can even see the crunching of the grass. You can see something going crunch, 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 and its stride is massive. I mean, you've got this huge, 6-7 foot stride, just crunch, crunch. And then it just stops about 20 feet in front of you. And it's just looking at you, but it's not coming through the ethereal vortex barrier enough to be seen, except it's there enough to move matter in the third dimension. So it's a trip. It's a trip. They're elementals, gang. They're elementals. So when we're talking about Sasquatch, the Lakota or the Western Sioux, they call Bigfoot, are you ready for this? Chiatanka. And Chia, it means older brother, and Tonka means big or vast or great in English. And so they just generally call him, that's where we get the big man. Chiatanka is what they call Bigfoot and always have. And they see him as a blessing. So what I think is fascinating about this is we don't see Bigfoot as anything but a myth. The native cultures, and I mean we, Western white, the immigrant culture of Western settlers to the United States, see Bigfoot, for the most part, many people do, as a hoax. And what's fascinating is there are so many native nations that not only acknowledge this being, not only acknowledge the being as being what we would term as an elemental, not only acknowledge that this being is a bridge being between nature and humanity to bring messages to humanity, they not only look at this being as holy and sacred, okay, yet they think it can also shapeshift. And I'll tell you, the shape-shifting is a huge, huge attribute of elementals. I've watched little people shape-shift into a bear, like a black bear, that just completely disappeared into thin air in Bighorn Canyon. And I was looking right at it, and it pulled a mystery fish out of a lake, except the lake didn't have one ripple on the top of the surface, and all of a sudden it just had this fish. I mean, I wasn't the only one who saw that. I was in a boat full of people who saw that. So these are beings that are here to help us get reacquainted, honestly, with our role and how far away we've gotten from nature. And honestly, from being part of something greater than ourselves, which really makes me sad. It makes me sad that we need a Bigfoot. We need a 12-foot tall being, God, to come here and say, hey, we probably should be conscientious. Now, if we're going off of the fact that Bigfoot is an elemental, Bigfoot is real, Bigfoot is physical, Bigfoot can also go through vortexes and travels with electromagnetic frequency ley lines, then if you're a Bigfoot hunter and you're listening to this, you guys should be out looking, you should be out in nature with K2 meters, like ghost hunting. You should be out in nature with EMF readers. Because where you find high yields of EMF and K2, you're going to be more prone to finding that vortex doorway where Sasquatch comes in and out. And you're not going to attract Sasquatch like an animal, gang, okay? You're not going to attract Sasquatch with donuts or bacon or any of these other things that people try to catch an animal with, because this being, though it is physical, it's not an animal. It's an elemental. So if you really want to see a Bigfoot, go ahead and go into a place of great reverence and great respect for the outdoors. And go into a place of not wanting to take ownership of this being or catch it or shoot it, but ask it for a message. And what we can do as human beings to literally better our chances of survival on this earth. I mean, this is kind of a big deal. It's kind of a big deal. So with the thought of Sasquatch being where we need help, okay, there have been Sasquatch sightings all over the world. Now, if Sasquatch is here to help human beings reacquaint with nature, reacquaint with being in the now, reacquaint with how many plastic bottles we're throwing into the oceans. I'll give you one big fat guess. In all of the world where the most Bigfoot sightings have taken place. You guessed it, the United States. We by far have just hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds more Bigfoot sightings than the rest of the world. This is a true story. I mean, when you look, and Canada has a whole bunch too. They've got a whole bunch up there, not as many as you might think, but it's interesting because most of those Bigfoot sightings in Canada have been around populated areas. And people think Bigfoot doesn't want to live by people. Yet if we think of Bigfoot as an emissary from the spirit world that's coming to tell humans that we're over the line, people, over the line in terms of how we are ruining the atmosphere and ruining the earth, then it makes sense. And when you look up in Canada, 130 Bigfoot sightings were in British Columbia. Manitoba had 31. Alberta, which can be fairly rural in places, was 42. But Ontario, 67 Bigfoot sightings that were reported. Now, there might be a lot more up there, and people might only be reporting a portion of these sightings. But I mean, when you get off of the North American continent, and I can't even tell you, Washington State has over 667 official Bigfoot reports, with the very last Bigfoot report being made on the Bigfoot Network, which is this killer website. If you go to bfro.net, you're going to see, it's all this Bigfoot research organization. It's so cool. Washington State, 667 of these reports. And the most recent report in Washington State was actually this month, 2019. Wisconsin, with all of its dairy and all of its lakes and all of its swampiness, has 100 Bigfoot sightings. West Virginia, 102. Now, Vermont has 9. I want you to think about the population of Vermont. That is think about it. It's an exceptionally environmentally conscious community, Vermont. And so how many Bigfoot sightings? 9. Okay. And the last one was in 2017. So at least reported. And then we've got other, Virginia has 79, Utah has 70, Texas, the great Lone Star state of Texas, where we have poked holes in the ground a bazillion times to pull out oil. And we have made Texas into Swiss cheese down there. Okay. And granted, it's a very large landmass for sure. Yet Texas has 240 sightings. 240 sightings. And the last one was reported in August of 2019. So when we look at Washington State, 667. Now, part of the reason that we're going to have a large number of Sasquatch reports in Washington State is that Washington is a huge expulsion zone. That's where you have geomagnetic energy that's just gushing up through the ground, and it creates a very heavy electromagnetic density in the atmosphere. And Washington State also has massive amounts of UFO sightings. Because of this, you've got Mount Rainier, Mount Baker, you've got Mount Hood, you've got Mount St. Helens. All of these are volcanoes in a straight line. And if you ever fly up from LA to Seattle, they're all out the right-hand side of your airplane window. That geothermal and geomagnetic energy, gang, opens up mega vortexes, and that's starting down at Mount Shasta, and it goes all the way up. And then you go all the way through Oregon. It's just fascinating. So there are geophysical reasons that there are a lot of Sasquatch sightings in Washington State. And there are a couple of other reasons. Washington State had the nuclear power plant out there in the Tri-Cities. Washington State has Joint Base Lewis-McChord, which used to be Fort Lewis and McChord Air Force Base. And they joined them together to be Joint Base Lewis-McChord. Now, why? Why would Sasquatch be out there? Well, if you've ever been around, Fort Lewis out in that Pacific Northwest area, and I was actually out there quite a bit. I have family, hi family, who lives out in Tacoma. And I grew up for a little bit in Tacoma, Washington. My dad was in the Army. And so I really got to know that area, and it was spooky to me. Oh, so many vortexes, so many elementals, just a heaviness in that area that I could detect. And I don't mean evil. It's not evil. We're just talking heavy electromagnetic densities in the Pacific Northwest because it's a geomagnetic expulsion zone, right? It's all physical. It's so weird. And I'm sure it's spiritual too. Yet being out in that area, I really got a chance to amalgamate with the types of flora and fauna out there. And I respected the density of the Pacific Northwest. And my dad was in the Army, and I got my tonsils out at the Fort Lewis Army Hospital, which was, pretty unfun. And I was sharing a bed. I had a ward. I was in a kid's ward, and I was probably 6 or 7. I wasn't very old. And I remember the place where Fort Lewis was, where our children's ward was. My dad worked on the base in Fort Lewis. And he was a social worker. So he counseled a lot of the vets that came back from the Vietnam War. And he did a lot of counseling work. So here I was staying overnight in this ward. And all I remember was feeling, I couldn't quite put my finger on it, but it was just the most haunted, creepy, weird old hospital because the land that Fort Lewis was on felt weird. We're talking serious vortexes, serious electromagnetic energy. Who even knows the VLF arrays, the very low frequency arrays they had running back at that time under the ground? It just felt creepy. So when we talk about the 667 Sasquatch sightings in Washington State, we are dealing with large disruptions and big airplanes of war at McChord Air Force Base. Geez, you should see those things land. They look like the sky has fallen. And then you've got all of this Army maneuvering and Army games out in the thick, dense underbrush of the Pacific Northwest out on Fort Lewis. It's eerie. It's freaking creepy. I have a very, very good friend, my friend Ray Hayden. He has this gorgeous house. He and his wife, Jessica, have a gorgeous, gorgeous 5-6 bedroom house that's right around that area by McChord Air Force Base. And my friend Ray and I used to run Maurice the Fish Records together, which was a really small record label, but it was awesome in the Pacific Northwest. An indie label. We had a great roster of artists. And we had people we ran it with, Susan Renville and Jolene Green, and we all ran this label. It was really cool. Juliana Montgomery at one time, who you might recognize from Montgomery House. We had a great time, and I was spending the night. I was up there for a tour, actually. I was spending a week. And I'm a musical artist, and I was up there, and we were having a huge label showcase that Ray had planned. And I was in this bedroom upstairs, and there was this eerie, bizarre, weird feeling coming through the window. And this wasn't Bigfoot. This was off-worlder. And I was receiving all of this crazy interference. It was way back in like 2009, 2010. I had a BlackBerry, and this creepy, eerie sound was coming through the BlackBerry. And that same eerie, creepy feeling is what I would get out in the Pacific Northwest when I would stumble into natural occurring vortex points. So again, let me recap. Washington State, 667 Sasquatch reports, where you've got the nuclear power plants out in the Tri-Cities. You've got major Air Force bases. You've got the naval base in Bremerton. There's a lot going on there that's not necessarily nature friendly. Not to mention, It's a massive expulsion point. So are you getting the picture of how Sasquatch works with us, not only with the natural vortex points, but also works with us in conjunction with how destructive we might be being as a species? And Washington State is fascinating because my grandma Pinky, Gladys Phyllis Farrow, God rest her soul. They called her Pinky. She had red hair. And she hated being called red. Oh my God. 1940s, everybody had a nickname. My Italian grandpa laid eyes on this redhead, lost his ever-loving mind, started calling her Red. And she said, don't call me Red. I don't like that. And he says, okay, Pinky, you'll be Pink. So she was Pinky from that moment on. And Grandma Pinky was telling me stories about growing up in the Pacific Northwest. And this was outside of the Olympia area, like around Shelton now. And her father was this gnarly old Welsh logger. And what they would do back in the old days, we're talking old growth forest, gang. We're talking those trees that you see in historic Northwest photos where there will be like 3 or 4 guys standing across a fallen tree because the trunk of it is just ridiculous. It's 15 feet in diameter. It's just insane. So that breaks my heart to think about that. I love trees. But anyway, my grandma was telling me a story of how her dad, he was the logging foreman, and he was one mean SOB. And they would log out, they were loggers. They would log out this old growth forest. And then once it was logged out, they would lay railroad tracks in and lay the track down and then pull the rail cars up far enough that they could load these massive old growth logs onto. So the teams of men that were up there, there was nobody up there except for this rail line that they were building to go logging. And so the people who worked in this environment, they lived in boxcars. They had beds in boxcars. They had a wood stove in boxcars. And that's what the loggers lived in. So my grandma, literally as a kid, she and my Auntie Dorothy, who was her younger sister, my grandma remembers being 5, 6, 7, 8 years old and being out in the middle of the Pacific Northwest. And she was homeschooled by her Aunt Genevieve, who was Cherokee. So my grandma told me a story one time. I was probably, 10 or 11 years old. And we were talking about, there was a TV show on, and they were talking about Bigfoot. And my grandma says, she used to call me Pal. I miss my grandma so much. She would say, Pal, do you think Bigfoots are real? And I looked at her and I would say, yeah, Grandma, I do. I do think they're real. Because I could tell. You look at the classic 1970s picture of the Bigfoot walking and whatever. But you could tell. You're like, yeah, that's a real thing. I can feel this. And my grandma says, well, I can tell you, I know they're real. And I said, well, how do you know, Grandma? And she says, well, I've seen one. And my grandma proceeds to tell me this story. And my grandma, you got to understand, okay, my grandma grew up in a freaking boxcar, people. Okay, she was so practical. She was a Capricorn, and like for Christmas, she would get a leg's egg of nylons and some chapstick. Practical. She wanted to get you practical gifts that you could actually use. And then she'd make you a velvet robe because she was a grandma. But anyway, Grandma was not a yarn spinner. Okay, she just wasn't. So here's this Capricorn Graham, and she grew up in a boxcar in the Pacific Northwest, and she tells me this story that one day she had gotten done with her studies, and she was playing ball, and the ball was made out of rags. They were so dirt poor. They were dirt poor living in these boxcars. And my grandma made a ball, and it was tied up in rags, and she was throwing it back and forth with her sister Dorothy. And my grandma said she was about 7 and Dorothy was about 4. And so they were throwing this ball back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. Well, she threw it. She kind of hucked it too hard at my Auntie Dorothy. And it went past her and it went into this bramble. And if you've ever been in the Pacific Northwest, you really don't want to you don't want to get into that wooded area because there is so much blackberry bramble and undergrowth and big spiders. I mean, spiders the size of a Volkswagen. I swear to God, they're huge in those Pacific Northwest rainforests. And literally, that's what was going on. I mean, they were logging rainforest up there because this was way before there were any regulations. So this ball goes into this thicket. And my grandma says she told Annie Dorothy to go get it. And well, Annie Dorothy cried and ran away. She was not going into the thicket to get the ball. So my grandma starts walking towards the thicket and the ball gets rolled out to her. And she got really excited because Annie Dorothy didn't want to play anymore. And her sister kind of ran off and whatever. So my grandma runs into the thicket because she didn't care. She was a total tomboy. She used to run miles and miles and miles in the forest. So she runs into the thicket and she says, and I ran right up and there was this little ape boy. And that little ape boy was just staring at me. And he had the ball. He was holding the ball. So then he rolled the ball back to me. And I rolled the ball back to him. And I said, well, Grandma, how did you know he was an ape boy? She says, because, honey, he was a little ape boy and he didn't have clothes on. It was pretty easy to see he was a little boy. So they were rolling this ball back and forth. And I said, well, Grandma, were you scared? And she goes, no, he wanted to play ball and I was so happy to be with him. She says, and then all of a sudden I heard this boom, boom, boom. And here comes the ape mama. And she said, I just remember I just kept looking up and up and up and up and up and up like I was looking up some monstrous tree. Because apparently, I said, how far were you from the ape boy? She goes, oh, I don't know, 5 or 6 feet. We weren't very far away from each other because this ball was made of rags. So it wasn't like it was scooting across the ground very easily. My grandma said she looked up and the ape mama just kind of huffed at her little ape boy, scooped him up under her arm, and just kind of made this like face at my gram, like, gosh darn it, he shouldn't be out here. He shouldn't be playing with you. And just went stomping back into the woods. And my grandma said that she got really sad because her little ape friend took off into the woods. So she told me that she went back to that same spot day after day after day and looked for the little ape boy, and she never found him again. And I looked at my grandma. My grandma had this impish way about her. My grandma was 100% Welsh. So I am confident that my grandmother had a lot of elemental genome in her. And we as human beings, a lot of human beings interbred with the elemental kingdom. We do share DNA. We are compatible with many of these beings. Some we're not genetically, but other ones we are. And if you go up into the very northern parts of Scotland, you're going to meet some folks who have some almost, oh man, I'd call them a human hybrid because they are so full of elemental DNA and they've got that really interesting yellow-orange eyes that the elemental kingdom has, that they'll just look right through you. And that's what elementals do. They are incredibly intuitive. So my grandma told me this story about Bigfoot. And I believed her because you would have had to know my gram, okay? She just was not a yarn spinner. Come on. Nylons for Christmas, okay? So I knew that these beings were real anyway. And then on top of that, I had my grandma saying, well, I saw one. And they're real. And she looked right at me. She says, pal, don't you ever let anybody tell you that Bigfoot isn't real, because it is real. And I said, well, what do you think it is, Grandma? And she said, I don't know. She says, but I don't think it's a creature that belongs to this world. So my elemental genome gram, I'm just saying, I think she looked like a little pixie fairy person. I think she just had an understanding with these beings. So as we go up the list, I'm not going to read you every single state here, but Ohio has so much manufacturing and all kinds of things. 290 Bigfoot sightings, 250 in Oregon. And of course, in Oregon, you've got that geothermal expulsion point like we talked about before. And then you have places like North Dakota, where there's only 6 Bigfoot sightings. However, in North Dakota, you have the Bakken. And so the last Bigfoot sighting to be reported in North Dakota was 2010. And I bet they're seeing a lot more Sasquatch up there since the Bakken oil field has been booming and they've been just desecrating that land up there. But the last sighting was documented 2010, and that was only 6, North Carolina has 97. Montana has 48 Bigfoot sightings. 48. And when you break it down by county, again, the biggest amount that you're going to find of anywhere is up by Missoula. And actually the last Bigfoot sighting in Missoula, Montana, they had 8 up there that they've reported total. And that looks like it was in July of 2012. However, when you look down here, Lewis and Clark County, which again, that's pretty wooded, okay, in Montana. So you've got mostly in Montana, you're seeing the Sasquatch around the mountainy areas. But the mountainy areas are also where there's mining, where there's logging. There's a lot going on. And plus, we do have some of those geomagnetic ley lines that run through Montana. I loved our house up in Gallatin Gateway. And that house was so geomagnetically just grounded. And it was like floating in a womb against the Gallatin Range. And in Gallatin County, there were 3 Bigfoot sightings recorded. And again, that's a pretty big county. It's not just Bozeman. There's a lot up there. So when you look at these areas just in my home state of Montana, it's fascinating because you can break down the Bigfoot sightings. And, it's very interesting. In August, a lot of these are in August, summertime. A lot of the Bigfoot sightings are in summertime. And that has to do with the fact that the Earth is in a very specific place and placement with the sun. Same reason why here in Montana, a lot of our UFO sightings are in June and July, because electromagnetically, especially with Yellowstone Park and all of the naturally occurring, the Rocky Mountain Belt fault lines, there's a whole bunch under the Rockies. Obviously, it's what made the mountain range, right? So when you actually get a chance to step back and look at the geomagnetic topography of Montana, our state lights up. The northern states, gang, are going to light up more for these elemental sightings because the elementals travel along the geomagnetic ley lines. And it's also going to light up for UFO sightings because a lot of our off-world cousins travel along those electromagnetic grids and the same vortex points that our elemental friends are using to go dimensionally in and out, okay? So Silver County here in Montana, that's fascinating. That's where you find Butte. And we shot part of a Road Angel episode up there. And Butte is, I can't even tell you, that town, if you ever get to Montana, you've got to go to Butte. Because Butte is fascinating. And it's got the Berkeley Pit. And the Berkeley Pit is a 2-mile deep, super fun, toxic lake that is just now starting to be able to grow life in it. And there's a whole group of healers, energy healers up in Butte and the surrounding areas, Helena and whatnot, that work on the Berkeley Pit to try to heal it because it's so freaking toxic that if it were to spill over and leave that pit, if a wall of the Berkeley Pit were to give way, Butte would be flooded, first of all. But secondly, that water is so highly toxic, it's going to kill everything. It kills birds that land on it, okay? But of course, only in Montana do we put an observation deck above that and say, hey, let's go look at this. It's a tourist attraction. So, there's 2 Bigfoot sightings in Silver County, and that's where this big Berkeley Pit is. So, I'm just using some of these places in, the United States where there's a lot of Bigfoot sightings. Obviously, California, we have that same geomagnetic ley line issue. We have lots of fault lines. We have lots of disruption. We have lots of overwater usage in California. Lots and lots. Florida has 325 Bigfoot sightings. 325. And again, the last one of those was reported, January, February, March, April of 2019. And Florida, they call it a skunk ape. It's a slightly different type of elemental in the south. A little bit smaller, a little bit stinkier, a little bit lankier, but it's still really, really tall. And Florida, out of all of our states, is the most vortex-riddled state ever. because it really is, it's about ready to go try to be underwater partially again as our ocean levels raise. And it was ocean bed. And the tip of Florida has 5 main ley lines, earth ley lines, that cross in a star pattern at the tip of it. So, and they got the Bermuda Triangle and blah, blah. So it's a very geomagnetically charged area that is full of vortex openings. And of course, as we see here, 325 Sasquatch reports. So, it goes on. And again, if you really want to look at this, go to bfro.net. You can take a look at where the reports are made. You can take a look at the counties, and you can take a look at, you will see that a lot of these Sasquatch reports are around more major metropolitan areas, not in the city, obviously, but they are closer to those areas because Sasquatch is the bridge that comes to tell people that, hey, we need to get into balance here. And it is a holy creature that wants to bring some sort of message to us that we too can be in balance with the world. And it's fascinating. You think, here's one that will blow your mind for the size of the country. All right, for the size of the country. Are you ready for this? Australia has 1 reported Bigfoot sighting in 2002. 1. Only 1. And Australia, one could argue, if we wanted to argue that this is actually a physical creature, that maybe it evolved on the North American continent, because obviously the United States and Canada have a huge, and that's northerly, have a huge amount of Bigfoot sightings. However, let's take a look at this. Australia is home to the Aboriginal people. And the Aboriginal people are as genetically close, as far as I can resonate with, to a true indigenous, actual, from the mother womb of earth human being that I can really find. That and, there's tribes in Africa also that are just are bubbling up from the indigenous womb of the earth. Western Europeans, we have so much Sirius AB genome. That's why we get this bulbous frontal cortex. There's a lot of off-world contribution to the human species, okay? Yet, and I'm not suggesting that, honestly, most everybody on Earth at this point is an immigrant or a descendant of an immigrant, because we had all of these off-world folks mixing this DNA in, and that's a totally different podcast. However, when I look at Australia and they have one Bigfoot report, maybe they don't feel like they need to report it. Yet my sense there is that the indigenous nations in Australia are in synchronicity with what's going on. And I'm sure Australia has its problems with pollution and whatever else, yet they house the Aboriginal nation. This is a group of people who can go on walkabouts and talk to each other telepathically and talk to the ground telepathically. You can't get much closer to the earth than that. And then you got we Western European whitey-tidies up here wandering around with our Sirius AB bulby cortex. We have been disconnected to a degree, genetically even to a degree, from as much of the holy earth energies. And we're working on getting all that back. And it doesn't make us lesser than. It just means that there are cultures. Also, there are indigenous cultures in South America that have absolutely just come as one with these incredible beings. And I'm looking on the list here, looking to see Bigfoot sightings in South America or, regions. And I'm just not seeing it. Now, China has 11 sightings. And China also has a lot of pollution, and they've got a lot going on over there. Russia has 5, and my guess is they have a lot more Sasquatch in Russia. But are you ready for this? The last one that was reported was in, and what is that? May of 1989. May of 1989. And what I think it's a Yeti. Theirs was a Yeti. And what I think about that too is, if you think about that, that's about the time Chernobyl melted down and took out 2,500 square miles of, if you haven't seen Chernobyl, you got to see Chernobyl. It is a heck of a series. But that's about the time that Chernobyl melted down. So it would make sense that our elemental community was stepping it up and coming forward and saying, okay, guys, let's not ruin the world. Okay, let's just not do that. So what I think is so fascinating here is we see an actual trackable pattern of Sasquatch being in the United States all over the place, and we are the most wasteful country in the known world. Are you hearing me? We are the most wasteful nation in the world. And we literally have hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of Sasquatch reports, coming out, a couple thousand, it looks like here, if I'm just doing the math in my head really quickly, coming out of the United States. So think about that. And of course, we're out trying to trap them and catch them and do all these things. And they're trying to come to us and say, hey, gang, could we just have a sense of temperance, please? So if you are a Bigfoot hunter, then I can tell you again, you're not going to attract Bigfoot with bacon. And they do have primate genealogy in them, yet they aren't apes. And people have talked about Sasquatch tree knocking. And Bigfoot hunters will get out and try to knock wood on trees. And apes do that. That's how they communicate with one another. So Sasquatch have been known to knock on trees. And they've also been known to make some really weird sounds. Really weird sounds. And, it's interesting. I talk a lot about Bighorn Canyon. And one time I was out on that boat with Wayne and Holly, and we were all out there. And I was sharing the back of the boat with my friend Holly. And we were sleeping on the back of the boat. And Holly sat straight up. And she said, oh my God, there was this weird sound. It wasn't a bobcat. It wasn't a bear. It wasn't an eagle. It wasn't an owl. It wasn't a badger. It was this yodely, crying, vocal cord sound thing coming off one of the canyon walls that was just right up the way from us. And it was kind of eerie. And then another one came out of the canyon back at it. So these things were calling back and forth to each other in the canyon. And Holly sat straight up. And she said, did you see that? And no, I didn't, because I was looking at the other direction. My head was the other direction. Apparently, she said there was this massive Bigfoot that just pulled itself right up over the canyon wall. And we were quite close to the canyon wall at that point, and the moon was hitting it. And she was freaked out for the rest of the night. She's like, no, I'm sorry. I saw this black silhouette, and it was huge, like a Bigfoot, and it pulled itself right up over the canyon. Well, we've had a lot of Bigfoot sightings and Bigfoot footprints in the Pryors and the Bighorns. Because again, that's heavy little people country. That's heavy elemental country. So what can we learn from the big man? What can we learn from the presence of Sasquatch or a Yeti or Bigfoot? They also found a lot of Yeti. They have a Yeti scalp that they found up in the Himalayas. And they considered the Yeti scalp to be sacred and holy because it was a creature that came to the monastery and brought good mojo. So we can learn balance from Sasquatch. We can learn that we too could learn to traverse these vortex portals. We could go through fairy wings. How the heck do you think people bred with fairies in the first place? We could get through them. We aren't sure how. We aren't sure how to control our resonation. We're not sure how to control our cell groups. All of this is how we get from point A to point B in our elemental realm. You go through those vortex points or fairy rings or electromagnetic doorways or however you want to put it. And we can learn from the big man that we are actually in a position to need to be greater stewards. Right now in the world, the Amazon rainforest is on fire. It is burning up. You look at it from space, it's this big old red match. I mean, it's awful. And I really wish they'd stop it. I hope they stop it if we lose our Amazon rainforest. Breathing's going to get to be a bit of a bummer. We still have a lot of oxygen coming out of the oceans, but still, I mean, that's a big deal if we lose the Amazon, because that's what's cleaning the earth up. So if we lose what's supposed to be cleaning the earth up, we're going to have to get really creative, plant a lot more trees, get crazy. Yet I can only imagine what the elemental kingdom must be doing in South America. And there are so many indigenous tribes in South America still, tribes that have not seen helicopters. They might see planes, but they don't know what they are. People don't make contact with them. And these beings are also extremely close to the womb and the heart of the Mother Earth. And they haven't been all noodled with like a lot of the westernized countries have genetically. And I get hate mail on this sometimes. People are like, racist that sounds. It sounds like you're saying that Western Europeans are of a different species. I'm like, I'm not being racist. It's the truth. It's what we are. There's no racism in that. It's not racist to point out that someone who is from Africa is going to be a person of color, and someone from Norway indigenously may not be a person of color. That is not racist. I am pointing out genetic traits in different areas of the world. And it's holy, it's sacred, it's amazing that we have all kinds of races, including our Native Americans. We have a lot of Native American races that, yes, they have the more bulby prefrontal cortex, but a lot of those folks barely, if at all, got noodled with genetically. More of that was going on up really in Europe. So again, that's another podcast for another time. However, just know this. If you're a Bigfoot hunter, I would change that to being a Bigfoot contactor. You don't really hunt UFOs, you try to contact UFOs. Bring EMF devices, bring a K2 meter, go out into nature and just sit quietly. It's scary, but you can do it in the dark, and think to yourself. If you want to make a very small fire, that's fine. Big fires kind of wig them out. And being able to just say, I would love to have a visit from the big man to tell me what I need to know about how I need to go forward to support our earth. That's how you're going to find a Bigfoot, gang. Not going out there and whooping and calling and whacking a tree with a stick. Although keep it up, because, they will answer sometimes. If they see you trying to communicate with them, if you're whacking a tree with a stick, sometimes they'll call and answer, which is cool. But I hope this has been enlightening from the perspective that there are so many things on our planet that we try to put into a box, and we don't even have the science to explain the box to put the thing in. And actually, big portions of what we like to call shadow government or shadow military has all kinds. They have all kinds of technologies that can open vortex points. It's just that we don't get to hear about that here in Anytown, USA, here in Billings, Montana, or up in Gallatin Gateway. You're not going to hear about it. So, gang, let us all in our own areas of the country and the world do our best to send respect, love, and care to the mother planet that hosts us. And especially for those of us in the United States, we need to get it together in terms of our wastefulness and our landfills. It is staggering what we do to the planet. So let's just, again, I'm going to give you the website for this particular, it's such an informative site. It's bfro.net. And that's the Bigfoot Field Researchers Organization. So if you are not part of the Bigfoot Field Resources, I can't talk tonight, you guys. Bigfoot Field Researchers Organization, you certainly can be. And on the front page of their website, they have all kinds of really cool, just cool stuff, really cool stuff. And they have a listing of 2019 Bigfoot expeditions that are currently accepting applicants, which is kind of neat. And so, you can go on there, and there's looks like British Columbia, Montana, Missouri, Illinois, Georgia, Kentucky, Michigan, Vermont, and Massachusetts look like the spots where they have active, apparently, things planned for this year. And I have no idea if those have already gone by or if they're coming up. However, it looks like the ones that are coming up, British Columbia, that's coming up. And so, of course, I shouldn't say that because I have no idea when folks are actually going to listen to this podcast. So go ahead and check out bfro.net, and you can maybe join one of these Sasquatch expeditions and potentially bring some new techniques to the field. And maybe you not only will get a photo of Sasquatch, yet maybe you'll also get the message that this great, beautiful, sacred, holy being is trying to send to us. All right, gang, always embrace your mystery, and I will see you next week.